So, a little bit about myself. A few years ago, I started a job at a website called Desmogblog. I started learning about the well-funded campaign by former tobacco lobbyists to confuse the public about the science of global warming. It really changed my life. Since then, I have focused much of my energy on the pursuit of truth and accountability to expose these campaigns that are trying to confuse the public and poison the public well. Right now, I work as a campaigner with a corporate accountability organization called SumOfUs.org. We run rapid response campaigns to hold corporations accountable to people. For example, we got Tim Hortons to commit to phasing out gestation crates in its supply chain. We raised $50,000 for a Texas farmer whose land has been seized by TransCanada to build the Keystone XL pipeline. And we worked to get $1 million of funding pulled from the Heartland Institute for telling people that belief in global warming was like being a terrorist or a serial killer. I also work as a freelance writer, and I write primarily about the tar sands and often the deep connections between our government and oil interests. As I see it, we are not just working to counter corporate misinformation any longer. We are working to counter an increasingly integrated regime of misinformation from oil companies, PR firms, and government. As young people, we value authenticity and truth, and we aren't seeing those values represented in our government right now, in our institutions, and in our corporations. We're flooded with misinformation that is designed to turn us off and tune us out and prevent us from being informed citizens who can meaningfully participate in our democracy. Trust in governments and institutions is eroding, and we don't demand more of corporations because, frankly, we don't expect more from corporations. I see my role and the role of other young people around me to be the truth diggers, helping hold corporations, oil companies, and our governments accountable. So, a story of me. I was born in Edmonton, and I was raised in Calgary. The parks and forests that I made tree forts and secret clubs in were in Calgary Southwest. As you know, that's Stephen Harper's writing. I grew up with strong values and beliefs. We talked politics at the dinner table. As the child of immigrants, I was told that Canada was the greatest country in the world and that we were lucky to grow up there. My infallible belief in government and institutions led me to pursue not one, but 2 degrees in political science. When I was 17 and becoming politicized, Stephen Harper was parachuted into my riding of Calgary Southwest, and Ezra Levant, the now Sun media pundit, stepped aside to allow him to run. I had no conception then of the oil-dominated politics that would come to transform my city and our country. When I used to travel abroad, I was proud to I held my passport like a badge of honor. But in my lifetime, the values of our country and institutions I grew up believing in have been compromised, crippled, and right now they are being dismantled. The country I learned about stopped existing inside the heart of its people. I think that this is one of the central problems of our era, and that's what I'm going to talk with you about tonight. A petrostate is when fossil fuel companies and the state become increasingly fused into one integrated regime. As somebody I really admire, Andrew Nikiforuk writes, "Dependence on income from a single staple, such as bitumen or natural gas, can weaken institutions, dumb down policy, concentrate power, cripple the economy, or even hinder democracy. Oil booms engender spending manias, poor statecraft, pathetic tax regimes, political extremism, and long periods of often authoritarian rule." I know that when we think of petrostates, our mind wanders to places like Saudi Arabia, Nigeria, Venezuela, Dubai, but the fact of the matter is that Canada is at a crossroads. If we continue down the path we are headed, our country will become a petrostate. Now, I first became concerned about this issue in 2010. One of my colleagues came and put a book on my desk. It was Ezra Levant's Ethical Oil. Now, at this time, Ethical Oil, this book was getting lots of coverage in Sun media papers. There was excerpts. He was on a book tour. He was winning book awards. And before long, government was starting to take up some of these talking points. And the Ethical Oil Institute was set up by Levant and a tar sands lawyer in Alberta. And immediately, former Prime Minister's Office staffer Ali Ken Velshi was placed at the helm. And Catherine Marshall, the wife of a Prime Minister's Office staffer, took the helm after him. As I began to look deeper, I saw a dense network of relationships between these organizations, showing they were coordinating their communications effectively integrated into a single regime. Now, petrostates invest heavily in public relations, and for me, this was the beginning of the fusion of fossil fuel companies and the state into one regime. Now, for those of us who live in British Columbia, earlier this spring, a full-on attack was launched against environmental groups and First Nations. This was not just organized by Ethical Oil or by the government. This is an integrated campaign between PR agencies, between government and between Ethical Oil. In a famous open letter to Canadians, Joe Oliver derided environmentalists as foreign-funded radicals and as threats to Canada's national interest. Now, a hallmark of parliamentary democracy is loyal opposition. The concept literally means that dissent is seen as patriotic, not as treason. But I believe that our government has declared war on environmentalists and has declared opposition as treason. By framing opponents to the expansion of the tar sands as foreign-funded radicals, they have delegitimized healthy, legitimate opposition that is integral to democracy. They've also invalidated the experience of Canada's First Nations and millions of Canadians who want a future for their children and families. The divisive language of radicals and enemies of the state means that either we are loyal Canadians who support the expansion of the tar sands, or we are disloyal ones who don't. There is no middle ground. Another hallmark of the petrostate is the concentration of power. Now, I know that a lot of us are aware of the things that have happened in the last year in our country. Cabinet can now overrule the Joint Review Panel without looking at environmental or climatic impacts of the expansion of the tar sands. Canada's Cruel Crime Bill and omnibus budget bills are two other examples of the growing concentration of power and contempt for public debate and oversight. These bills are scathing attacks on democracy that have set our country back decades. And soon, our Species at Risk Act may be the next on the chopping block. Currently, many of my friends who work for charities are being audited, and being audited with increasing frequency. And I see it as nothing more than a distraction, keeping these groups who do fundamentally important work in solidarity with people who live on the front lines of pipelines and the tar sands is a problem. And just this week, many of you will have seen that news broke that our government has set up a counter-terror unit to protect tar sands development in Alberta. I want us to understand that these things are all very connected. And a further implication that I see as very connected is that the strong arm approach of the Prime Minister's office and the massive advertising budgets of oil companies are putting major pressure on our media to limit their critique of the tar sands. Not only are First Nations and environmental organizations under attack, but the media, which performs a vital function in our democracy, is feeling the effects of this chill too. Now, this is something that very few people are talking about, and it certainly isn't a part of the policy decision and the policy discussion in our country, but in communities on the front lines of the tar sands, the impacts of the tar sands are considerable. First Nations communities are battling rare forms of cancer, are struggling to live traditional lifestyles from the land because of encroaching tar sands development. Their water is being drained from the rivers and that these communities use for fishing, and the water is being poisoned. I met a clan grandmother earlier this spring when I was on the Freedom Train, which I'll talk about in a bit, who was born on the banks of the Athabasca. And she tells me that she can no longer find her traditional medicines that she forages for because of tar sands development in her community. Our government stance also negates the considerable impact that oil extraction has on women. In Fort McMurray, there's a women's crisis center called the Unity House, and it's right now fighting for its survival. It has to turn away, on average, 100 women a year and their children because of lack of space and funding. Policies are failing to understand the root causes of systemic violence against women and the linkages to how we treat our Mother Earth. There are epidemic rates of sexually transmitted infection in the community, and I've spoken with former sex workers who've told me stories of working in Alberta. And given that house prices in Fort McMurray are higher than they are in Alberta, women are statistically more likely to return to abusive homes because of the cost of living and a lack of housing. Finally, our government stance is not even focused on the climate. If we want to stop catastrophic climate change, we simply cannot expand the tar sands. It's either or. They say of petrostates that over time, oil revenues can either strengthen authoritarian regimes or weaken democratic ones. The reasons are simple. Oil states can, with petrodollars, buy support or marginalize dissent. But what I want to tell you today is that the Harper government is trying to marginalize voices through derision and division, but it's failing in its efforts to buy support because First Nations are standing up to assert their rights and title, and people are using investigative journalism and people-powered campaigns to hold our government and corporations accountable. And you know what? I do believe that the tides are turning and we are starting to reclaim our democracy. This year, the Yinka Dene, an alliance of 5 First Nations on the Enbridge Northern Gateway pipeline, who have banned tar sands pipelines from their traditional territories, set off on a historic freedom train across the country that ended in Toronto, where they went to the Enbridge shareholder meeting. They delivered a message directly to Enbridge shareholders that the water is not for sale, the land is not for sale, their traditional lifestyle is not for sale. I had the incredible honor of traveling as an ally on the Freedom Train, and it was one of the most incredible experiences of my life. Back in British Columbia, where I'm from, the Tsleil-Waututh and Squamish nations paddled through the Salish Sea in Vancouver to show their opposition to the Kinder Morgan pipeline expansion, another tar sands pipeline that goes through Vancouver. And this week, the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation launched a constitutional challenge to the Shell Jackpine mine expansion. In British Columbia, in a couple of weeks, what could be the single largest act of civil disobedience is happening in Victoria on October 22nd. Hundreds of people are engaging in peaceful civil disobedience at the BC legislature to send a powerful statement that BC's coast is not for sale. I'm so inspired by the momentum that is building right now to demand more of our government, institutions, and corporations. Together, we are countering the integrated communications of oil companies and the government who are poisoning the well of our democracy and our ability to take real action on the challenges of our time. And as youth, though few of us hold office or command powerful institutions yet, we are proving that we hold a different kind of power, rooted in our passion, our enthusiasm for collaboration, our non-hierarchical ways of organizing, and our willingness to do things differently. I know that our work is far from over. We need to continue countering misinformation with good investigative journalism, demanding more of our media. We need to learn to be better allies with First Nations. And we need to launch people-powered campaigns. And we need to work together to break the mold, to challenge the status quo, to rebuild trust, and to forge a new political consensus. Everyone in front who will speak with you before you tonight is deeply engaged in this work. And for now, I'm going to pass on the microphone to these fine people. I'm excited to chat more with you in the future. Thank you very much.
Hello, Sego, Skanagoa. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for everybody for being here. My name is Ben Powless, as mentioned. I'm from the Gunyakahagan Nation, otherwise known as the Mohawk Nation, the Wolf Clan. Yeah, it's okay to laugh or cry. I'm going to be talking about a little bit of colonialism, Aboriginal issues tonight, Indigenous rights issues. This is one of my favorite photos ever, by the way. I didn't take it, but it's still amazing. The rest of the photos in the slideshow, I did take. I do some photography once in a while. And I want to start out talking about myself a little bit, because they asked me to talk about myself, and I don't normally like to do that, so I'm not really going to do that. But I'm going to use the time to talk about my parents, because I want to give them a lot of credit for why I'm here today and why I was such a happy child. Apparently, I just found these photos recently. These are my grandparents, not my actual parents. But I grew up in Ottawa. I didn't grow up on the reserve, but I had a lot of connection with my home community, Six Nations. Being born Native, I found out quickly in Canada, is a bit of a political act. My father has always been an activist as well, involved on a national scale with Aboriginal politics. My mom has always been involved at a sort of local level. She helped found an Aboriginal women's shelter in Ottawa. So a lot of people have said that I come by it honestly. I think I learned and inherited a lot from both of them, and really got my start when I was in university. I became involved with a number of different environmental organizations at the beginning, including a group called the Youth Environmental Network, which no longer exists because their funding was cut. We'll get to that. And also with another group called the Canadian Youth Climate Coalition, a group that I still do a lot of work with. And what stood out to me, what really drew my attention and got me involved with these groups was that I really found that they were on the forefront of this environmental justice movement, a really growing movement in Canada, around the world, that really stands in contrast to the traditional mainstream environmental movement. And I think that's really come to be because a lot of people have recognized over the past number of years that the mainstream environmental movement doesn't speak to a lot of people, doesn't engage a lot of people, because it doesn't take issues like gender, like race, like poverty, capitalism, the Global South into consideration. And particularly in a North American context, it's been fairly silent on colonialism and Indigenous rights. Ironically, at the same time that most destructive environmental projects are taking place on Indigenous lands in North America. And that really led me to get involved with a group called the Indigenous Environmental Network, who I continue to work with today, which has its principal focus on Indigenous rights, on environmental justice, on empowering grassroots to lead the struggles of their communities, connecting communities with each other, naming and shaming Canada everywhere, the UN, the world stage, and informing Canadian society of a lot of these issues as well. Did anybody go to the She Speaks event last night? A few people in the crowd. It was pretty good. I encourage you, if you didn't have a chance to make it, there should be a video up on YouTube in the next few days from the event itself. I encourage people to look it up. So my involvement with the Indigenous Environmental Network here in Canada got me involved a lot working on tar sands. I know Emma's already talked a lot about that. I actually ended up doing a tar sands photo documentary. I spent about 7 weeks traveling between different communities in northern Alberta that were impacted by the tar sands. And you'll see a lot of the photos, or a bunch of the photos from that photo documentary. The real intent behind that being to try and document, to try and expose a lot of the depravity, a lot of the environmental destruction happening on the backs of Indigenous communities for the benefit of a privileged few in Canada. And I've also been present at a lot of the United Nations climate talks, where I've had the unfortunate opportunity to see Canada become the lead climate criminal around the world. And over the past number of years, one of the things that, working with Indigenous communities, working with a lot of First Nations across the country, we've been really feeling is that there's an effective war on First Nations. This is nothing new, of course, this is part of an ongoing process, but really has been renewed with the rise of, I think they're called now the Harper government, is what they're using in press releases. I think they got the idea that Canada's new government was getting old fast. But I want to remind us that this government is one that fought against the residential school apology, actually fought against it, argued against it, argued that residential schools were beneficial for First Nations, until they were actually ordered by the court to issue the apology and then pay a lot of the survivors. Immediately afterwards, they cut the funding to the Sisters in Spirit initiative, which was investigating missing and murdered Aboriginal women across the country. I think effectively betraying the intention and the words behind the apology. This is a government that's right now spending millions of dollars in a court case against the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society, which is arguing that the fact that the government underfunds First Nations schools is unfair and unjust. The government's arguing against that, saying, no, that's fair. And they're spending millions of dollars doing that. This is the government that voted against the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, joining the United States, Australia, and New Zealand. Eventually, they were pressured into signing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, a really paramount human rights legislation passed at the United Nations level in 2010, except that they said that they were not going to actually follow the most important parts of it, because those were in conflict with Canadian society. This is a government that's right now trying to privatize reserves across the country. This is a government that's been caught spying on First Nations, including the First Nations Family Caring Society and a number of communities. Just a quick question, how many people here from CSIS, RCMP? You can talk after, okay. I could go on, but there's a lot more to be said about this war on First Nations, but it stands in addition to an effective war by the government on science and evidence-based policy making in this country, on the environment, on media, on women's rights, on labor, on democracy and our right to participate, and potentially real wars as well. And I think it's a situation, especially for First Nations, that's only going to get worse as Canada returns to this neo-colonial economy, returns to an economy of hewers of wood and drawers of subsidies, or petro state, as Emma so eloquently put it. For First Nations, this has really led to the understanding that their issues, their rights are not going to be taken seriously or taken into sort of public understanding unless they're protesting, unless they're blockading, unless they're making the front page of the news somehow. And this shouldn't have to be the case, but it is. And it's partly the case because the government is only scared of and only takes into consideration First Nations when we are united, but particularly when First Nations become united with allies across the country, so-called settlers population. One of the things I think, though, we have to seriously understand and work with is that First Nations opposition, based on our unique political and legal relationship with the government, gives the best hope of stopping and slowing down a lot of these really destructive projects, including the tar sands, the pipelines, a number of proposed mines across the country. And that's, I think, one reason to support First Nations in the struggle. Not the only reason, but it's an important one. But more broadly than that, I think we have to also recognize that across this country, there yet stands to be a real Indigenous rights regime. It's really lacking right now. The UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples was a crucial first step, but there's been little movement beyond the words put into signing that document. A number of court cases have come up because First Nations are often forced into a legal position to defend themselves, and they've often supported Indigenous communities versus different levels of government. But what typically happens after that is that the government then goes on to ignore those rulings by the courts. And we're left in a position where we have to ask ourselves, who in this country is going to enforce the laws against the government? It's not going to be the United Nations, it has to be the people of Canada. And Emma mentioned in particular the Shell case that Fort Chippewa First Nation is brought up against Shell and the different levels of government, which would be precedent-setting, and it would be a great win, but it's only going to be precedent-setting and a win because the government hasn't been following its own laws. We're basically being forced into a position where we have to take them to court to say, listen, here's what it says in the Constitution, here's what the Supreme Court has said, follow that. And I think that this, even this presentation is not complicated enough. And, I apologize, I was trained as a little bit of an academic, and this is what they tell us to do. But I want to identify an even larger split beyond the environmental movement. And that would be with, Indigenous groups, Indigenous organizations and movements, and the mainstream and progressive left in Canada, which has only really been temporarily reconciled their differences on a few issues. And I would say that because I think there's a problematic assumption out there that the mainstream left in Canada supports Indigenous struggles. And I think that's true, though maybe mostly at a superficial level. But there's also a large history of mistrust, of a lack of positive relationships, understanding, and respect that needs to be bridged first. Indigenous struggles for sovereignty, for self-determination, and for human rights may in fact conflict with some of the liberal ideas, small L liberal, of multiculturalism, of rough equality, and of maintaining the current system of government, not government, but governance that we have in Canada. And to go even further, I would say that Indigenous peoples in Canada often have a completely different agenda and different goals than progressive society. Sometimes those goals may be in conflict, which is a tragedy for small L liberalism, big L liberalism too, maybe. And I really think that that's something that really needs to be stressed, really needs to be addressed in this country. And of course, I should add the caveat that First Nations are not necessarily all united, monolithic. There are a huge range of positions out there, but I think the point still stands. Now that's the bad news, maybe. The good news is, I think, though, we should also recognize that democracy, social justice, and other goals that we have are probably also in conflict with the current system of governance and the lack of respect out there for Indigenous peoples. And the reason I say this is that, my intention is that hopefully at one point we can get to a place where Canadians can at least understand and hopefully support Indigenous issues and Indigenous struggles, but not just based on the idea of reconciliation, which has been widely put out there, which for many Native peoples is a code word for Indigenous peoples having to reconcile with the state, but instead focus on a renewed relationship, going back to a lot of the roots of the original relationship that Indigenous peoples shared with the founding governments of this country. There's one last problem I want to raise, and that's the fact that we can't fix these problems if we don't have the tools. And not just the simple kind of tools that we can get at Canadian Tire, but I'm talking about the real state of lack of democracy that we have in the country. And I don't want to go too deeply into this because I think others are really going to speak to this. But we often hear the phrase thrown around that the system isn't broken, or the system is broken. And I would like to contest that and say the system isn't broken. I think in large part this is how it was meant to function. The original purpose of this British parliamentary system was not to involve and enfranchise most people. Most of the population of this country couldn't vote originally, referencing half the country, women, as well as all Aboriginal groups in this country, only gained the right to vote recently. But even more to the point, I think, is that if you consider during any one of our lifetimes, depending on how long we live, we maybe get 30 chances to have a say at a national level, voting. That's our democracy quota. And that, choice is limited to who represents us in government and, very limited beyond that. Another way of putting that is that during our entire lifetimes, we have about maybe 8 hours, if we're lucky, of actual engagement in a democracy, which is less than watching all 3 Lord of the Rings movies and probably less satisfying too. I would go so far as to call what we have more akin to an elected dictatorship, where in Canada, I'm borrowing from academic works, we have more executive power invested in one man than any other democracy around the world. And this is something I think really needs to be changed and that we should not accept. So that moves to the last part, the part looking forward. And I think what I've said, obviously, it outlines the need for a lot of different groups to begin working together and begin shifting these things around. And I want to focus on a few specific areas, because there's lots that needs to be done for First Nations to be able to trust and work with mainstream society, which I think we would all identify as a positive goal, even those members of society that already self-identify as allies. And I, want to be able to say that, I'm not speaking to individuals here. I don't hold you individually responsible for injustices against First Nations. This is really a systemic level criticism. We must recognize that the rest of Canada benefits from the inequalities that exist in this country. Native lands have been flooded to make dams for our electricity. Our forests have been cut down to sell softwood to the Americans. Tar sands are dug up beneath Indigenous communities to flood the world with our unethical oil. Land was stolen, right where we're sitting tonight, from the Mississauga people to make way for the city we call Toronto. These are just a few examples, but the idea is that there's a responsibility on all of Canada to rectify these injustices. Acknowledging that, I think the first focus needs to be on education. And I want to say that the education system has failed, I think, all Canadians, First Nations and non-First Nations alike, in lying to you about Indigenous history. My dad told me when he was a young boy in his class, growing up, a young Native boy, they actually told him there were no more Native people in Canada, which directly conflicted with his own experience. But this is the state of education in very recent times in our country. I think it's imperative that we as a society start taking the time and effort to learn, to educate ourselves, to educate others about the different histories in our country. There's so much work to be done in doing that, and I often get the sense that a lot of people have the idea that First Nations are the ones who should be out there educating, which a lot of us are. But there's a lot of First Nations who are, dealing with their own difficulties, relearning our history and our culture, which was lost in many cases. And, sometimes we like going to parties and not having to talk about the Indian Act all the time. I don't mind, it's cool, but some people do. I'm actually maybe writing a book right now, and I wish I could be able to, be like, hey, buy my book. It may be coming out in, I don't know, probably 2 years or something like that. But there's a lot of other good resources out there, and I do encourage people to look some of them up. Particularly, some of my favorite authors are Dayaki Alfred and Leanne Simpson. But there's also the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, and that's available for free, and it's one of the most extensive and comprehensive resources, I think, available to Canadians as a result of many, many years of intensive consultation research to put that together. I'm also going to link, I have a link to a PDF at the end of the speech that basically deals with a lot of this history as well. Secondly, as we move forward on these issues, I think we have to really get past the legacy of many leftists, many green causes and movements which have narrow-mindedly and reactively aimed to defend their own interests and issues, and really take a lesson and inspiration from the modern feminist movement and their approach to intersectionality, understanding how all aspects of identity contribute to injustices, and use that to build our movements, and use that to build what some would call a movement of movements. Third, I think we need to start envisioning what decolonization looks like in our society, start thinking about what it looks like at an institutional level and a personal level. And here I'm thinking about, big societal changes, take a lot of inspiration from a lot of the work that went into getting to the point of post-apartheid South Africa, recognizing that there's, a very big difference between Canada and South Africa, and also recognizing that, the Indigenous peoples in this land, of course, not a majority, and this, of course, is going to require the work of all Canadians. But as American leftists reminded the United States right before they prepared to invade Afghanistan and Iraq, regime change starts at home. Fourth, I think, along the same lines, one of the most concrete personal ways that we can do that we can start to decolonize, that we can start to move forward, is reconnecting with the land and renewing the relationship with the natural world, with Mother Earth. I think that losing that connection is a large reason why we're so sick as a society, mentally, physically, and spiritually, both mainstream society, but also particularly First Nations who have been disconnected from the land. And I think especially people who grew up maybe in Toronto. I'm just going to say that. Fifth, I think we need to redefine and start renewing a lot of relationships we have with one another, seriously looking towards building strong, healthy, and inclusive communities, but also building links between communities, and recognizing that the success of a lot of social movements that we've seen recently has been because they've been so much based in their communities and based in really strong, healthy communities. Lastly, I want to bring up one more idea from social movement theory that says that most people only change the way that they live when injustices and grievances become personal, and that they have an idea that things can be made better. I think perhaps we're at a situation today where not enough of us feel personally impacted by the things that I've been talking about, that Emma's been talking about, that others will talk about tonight. I think that's partly because we've lost our connection to land, and partly because we lost the connection to each other. Recognizing that most big social change has come when we stop recognizing others as others. And I think this is what we really have to strive for, recognizing that what happens in a remote community in northern Alberta does matter, that we should take it seriously, and could just as easily be happening to any of us. Then the last part of that is the idea that things can be made better, what some would call hope. Is something that we also must foster, nurture, and feed until nothing can stop it. And is one of the reasons why we have to make sure we have the tools to make those things better and working towards something that we could call a democracy. So just to wrap up, I think that there's a lot of changes that are before us that are, from preventing runaway climate chaos from the tar sands, decolonizing ourselves and our society, general environmental collapse, water, food shortages, the list goes on, and of course, this broken system that we have. It's an ambitious agenda, but at its core based on education, internally and externally, humility, building links between people, decolonization through renewing the relationships that we have with Mother Earth, rebuilding and renewing our human communities, acting in solidarity with grassroots struggles, and hope, things that I think are accessible to us all. And being here, being asked to speak here tonight alongside these other amazing young activists, seeing everybody here to listen, to participate, fills me with a lot of hope personally. And I hope that we are able to continue this conversation, that people here are able to continue this conversation wherever you may see fit. So I just want to finish off by saying that I work with the Indigenous Environmental Network. Our website is up here. You can see some of my photos, but also particularly the photo story. If you want to check out the photo story, it's got a lot more explanation on the situation in northern Alberta. And feel free to contact me, find me on the Twitterverse or the Book of Faces. I really want to extend a huge amount of appreciation to CCPA, to the organizers of this event for having me here. This is a tremendous honor to be invited to speak here, particularly such an illustrious event as a David Lewis Memorial Lecture. And thank you all for coming and being part of this. Nyaongoa, thank you.
Hi, everybody. How's my volume? All right. Feels good? Cool. I have a ridiculously bad cold right now. So I've been hacking up a lung all day, and right now I can only really talk because of the heroic work of our campaigns director, Matthew Carroll, to fill me with various kinds of herbal and pharmaceutical remedies. So I want to start off by thanking him. It's a huge pleasure to be here to speak with you tonight, to share a stage with Emma and Ben and Brigette, and to help be a part of supporting the launch of the CCPA Ontario. My name is Jamie Biggar. I work with an organization called Leadnow.ca, and the title of this talk is Democracy is Love. And I'm going to start off by telling a couple of stories about how I got into this work, a couple of stories that focus on ruptures and fractures. Then I'm going to talk more about the meaning and the opportunity of the Harper years. And then at the end, I'm going to talk about practicing democracy and how democracy is love. So I started off I actually cut my teeth as an activist working on peace issues around the Iraq War. That was when I was an undergrad. My first activist act was to send a 30-page, single-spaced, unreferenced letter to the entirety of the Canadian Parliament, explaining to them what I thought were the reasons behind the Iraq War, and inviting them to not join it. I got one response that felt vaguely personalized, and it was from Joe Clark. After that, I became interested in these intersected issues of political power, financial power, oil, and the environment. And I quickly developed a passion for climate change as an issue, and realized that climate justice was the core not only the core moral issue of our time, but also such a profound challenge to our society, to the way that we organize ourselves, that through trying to address the crisis of climate catastrophe, we could in fact build a radically better future. And I started working as a student organizer with youth, particularly in BC, And we would run collaborative planning processes where we brought students, staff, faculty, and regional partners together to come up with climate solutions for the universities that would help them to not only green their own operations, but actually become engines of regional sustainability. These efforts did a lot to change the conversations within universities out in BC and to drive forward to build support and build consensus around more ambitious climate policy at a university level across the province. But at the same time as we were having so much success from the ground up with these ground-up democratic processes, at the same time as that was happening, this was in 2006, 2007, 2008, at the same time as that was happening, we were watching our government at a federal level do more and more to block progress on climate change, both at a national level and at an international level. In the fall of 2008, I remember being kind of swept up in the fervor around the election of Barack Obama in the United States, and I hadn't at that point actually paid particularly much attention to Canadian politics. I remember that fall that we had a federal election as well, and with climate as my core issue, I watched 62% of Canadians cast ballots for parties that were committed, 62% of Canadian voters, I should say, cast ballots for parties that were making commitments to climate action, to strong climate action. And given that that was the year that Stéphane Dion was running on the Green Shift, I think that's quite meaningful. Yet, because of our flawed, deeply dysfunctional first-past-the-post electoral system, we ended up with a minority government dominated by the one party that was opposed to strong climate action and was going to act against the will of a majority of Canadians. I got an email from a friend who explained to me how a coalition government could work. And me and another friend put together this completely terrible website called Canadians for a Progressive Coalition. And we had this really hokey YouTube video that explained with like a black on white numbers about how the coalition could work and the number of seats in parliament and how these other parties could form a government and take on issues like climate change. And we even had our own petition, which I think got about 500 signatures, which we were very happy with, and a Facebook group. All of a sudden, Prime Minister Harper announced a budget bill towards the end of 2008 that contained two things. First, it had this is the midst of a massive economic crisis. It had no stimulus, and it contained a provision to eliminate the per vote subsidy. And the opposition parties responded by seriously talking about forming a coalition. And what we saw was our YouTube video and our Facebook page and our website all of a sudden went totally viral, and we went from having 500 signatures to 30,000 signatures, and the parties themselves used our video to explain to their own activists how the coalition could work, and started adopting the language that was in our video. What we saw in that moment was how the internet could be used as a tool to help aggregate the voices of thousands of Canadians and help shift the national conversation. It allowed us to actually be the primary pro-coalition voice in national news media during that time. Now, of course, on the other side of that, there was a disciplined, integrated movement that counterattacked with essentially a smear campaign that this represented some kind of separatist, sovereigntist coup, as opposed to the normal, legitimate functioning of our democracy. At that time, when the Governor-General, Michel Jean, accepted Prime Minister Stephen Harper's request to prorogue Parliament in the face of a confidence vote, I believe that there was a fundamental rupture in our democratic tradition, that there was a fundamental rupture in our democracy that happened at that time. Flash forward another year, and we were working with, I was part of the Canadian youth delegation to Copenhagen, and I remember being part of this incredible group of 30 young people who went to Copenhagen, the Copenhagen Climate Conference, to represent our country and to speak to the imperative to take strong climate action and to speak on behalf of a majority of Canadians who supported that position. In the lead up to the conference, we'd worked extensively to pressure Parliament to have the opposition parties, which at the time represented a majority, pass the Climate Change Accountability Act so that we could say to the international community that actually, despite our government's presence there, our representatives of a majority of the population supported strong action and that Canadians wanted action and were not being represented by our government. I remember one night in particular, a moment that made me think of the different stories of Canada and what Canada can be. There was this Yes Men prank, a hoax, where they released a fake media release that announced that Canada, instead of being one of the primary countries blocking progress for a climate deal that could have gotten the ball rolling to prevent catastrophic climate change, that Canada had in fact completely reversed their position and was going to be a force for climate justice in the world. And it was this amazing moment that went viral in global news media, and it was telling the story, I think, of the Canada that many of us have believed in and that believed existed. Yet, when we gathered that night, 30 young people gathered around a TV in our hostel, when we gathered to watch the nightly news and to see this story about the Canada that could be and that we could believe in, we'd been bumped. We'd been bumped off the nightly news by another story. And that story was that the environment minister at the time had that one of his presentations to cabinet had leaked, and that his official position at the Copenhagen Climate Conference was actually a lie, and that the true position of the Canadian government was even worse. That the targets that they were putting forward, the action plans that they were talking about taking, that all of that was hollow, that the reality was much, much worse. I experienced something watching that on TV with 30 other youth activists. I experienced something unique in my life. I experienced a moment of transcendent, white-hot rage. I felt like my generation, the delegates from Africa who were talking about how 2 degrees was suicide and 3 degrees was genocide, and from Small Island nations who were going to face the worst of these brunts, that our official government policy was to lie us into the ecological equivalent of Armageddon. For the first time in my privileged, very privileged life, I felt like an outsider. Like the social contract, the basic social contract that we give the state authority over us in exchange for a basic level of security, that social contract had been ruptured. And I sat there in a rage for about 2 minutes. And what brought me back was the people in the room with me. Quickly, other members of the Canadian Youth Delegation began to rally each other. They began to talk about how this wasn't an end, this was just a beginning. About how we were going to go back to Canada and we were going to organize. And we were going to make sure that nothing like this ever happened again. My despair turned into faith, my grief into gratitude, and my fear into joy. I experienced what Miriam Greenspan calls emotional alchemy, when we go deep into our dark emotions in order to actually liberate the most positive emotions that can drive us forward. And so what I want to talk about in my remaining time is the opportunity of these years. These are years for political alchemy. Across the country, we have seen a growing and rising opposition to anti-democratic action by our state. We've seen a growing recognition that anti-democratic action is not just bad because democracy is good in principle. It's not just bad because democracy is an ideal. It's bad because bad democracy means that someone is trying to do something bad to you. If they don't want you to know about it, if they don't want you involved in the decision, it's probably not something that you would want. In these years, as people feel so much negative, dark energy out of Ottawa, this is a time for us to grow opposition and to build. With Leadnow, as we have helped people strengthen their voices together to hold this federal government accountable, We've grown from a little over 5,000 members in our campaigning community to 200,000 members in a year and a half. But we know that growing opposition isn't enough. With the logic of a first-past-the-post electoral system, growing opposition puts us on a path towards US-style two-party polarization, which ultimately undermines, ultimately two-party style polarization undermines it creates a cycle it turns politics into a cycle of revenge. It exacerbates the worst aspects of our current political system by creating more and more incentive for voter suppression, more and more incentive for hyper-partisan politics and divisiveness, and more motivation for hyper-targeted, individualistic promises to particular swing voters in particular areas to get them on board with boutique tax cuts and other policies that actually split us apart instead of bringing us together. The key move in this time is to both grow opposition to anti-democratic and anti-equality action, but also to harness and to organize these communities to practice democracy so we can rebuild our social trust and create the foundation for a new majority consensus that goes far beyond changing election outcomes, but a new majority consensus that can, in fact, change the very parameters within political debate occurs, so that it becomes possible for our country to rise to the challenges of our time. We've been calling that at Leadnow political alchemy, the transformation of growing opposition into a new majority consensus. And it's why we've begun to think of democracy as love. Bell Hooks, amazing feminist author, describes love as says that love is not a noun. Love is not just a state. It's not a thing. Love is a verb. Love is an action. Love is something you do. She defines love as a commitment, the will to commit yourself, to expand yourself in order to support the growth of yourself and others. And it is that spirit that we need to imbue in our politics and in our organizing. It is that spirit that we are not only against, but that we are also interested in hearing what other people think. That we're ultra interested in beginning to practice democracy both outside of the formal system and inside of the formal political system, with new experiments in dialogue and consensus building that can make us really think about what it would take to mobilize a majority of Canadians to rise to the challenges of our time. There is a huge amount of opportunity for this in Canada right now. We are living in an end time. We are living in a time when there is no majority consensus. There was a post-war consensus between big governments, big unions, and big corporations that built the middle class. That's been burned down by neoliberalism, leading to a state where people trust neither governments nor corporations. There was a Laurentian consensus in Canada where elites from Montreal, Toronto, and Ottawa largely controlled the country through their own internal negotiations. This last election in 2011 marked the first time that the Laurentian consensus is no longer in control of the country, but that instead the country is in fact being run largely out of Calgary and by what is an attempt at creating a new petro-state consensus. The post-war consensus and neoliberalism have burned each other down. The Laurentian consensus has been shattered by the rise of political economy in Calgary. This is the opening, this is the space in which we can try to build a better consensus, a new majority consensus that is actually more inclusive of Canadians, that is more ambitious in its ability to bring us together, and that is more desiring of helping to facilitate a process of Canadians coming together to choose our own future. And what I'll just say at the end then is I would invite everyone in the crowd to think about, over these next few years, to think about how together We can practice political alchemy, how we can embody love in our democratic work, and how we can build a foundation to transform our political order to make it possible for us to address the major challenges that are facing our society. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Brigette. It's wonderful to be with you this evening. I like the title, Rabble Rouser. I must say, it has been an incredible journey in these past few months, and it has been really incredible to meet the people who are organizing on the ground. And I want to thank all of those people for the incredible work that they're doing and that you're doing. It was very difficult when I was working as a page in the Parliament. It's interesting because I went to a protest, civil disobedience in Washington, and someone was handing out signs, and they had these signs that were to stop the Keystone XL pipeline. And they had so many signs, they were trying to find someone to hold it. And the person standing beside me said, "Oh, give one to her. She's a professional sign holder." So, I mean, this is something that this is something that when you're growing up, you don't imagine that that could be what you're doing when you're older. I left Winnipeg to become a page. I'm not from a family that is very political. My mom, she works at Walmart in the fitting rooms, and my dad is a consultant for development projects. So actually, it was the CCPA, which was a really foundational experience for me. I was working as an intern in the office in Winnipeg, and I had a really wonderful mentor, Shauna. She's the director of the CCPA in Winnipeg. And it's a very good thing that she introduced me to the alternative federal budget, because it was very useful when I was debating with my dad. And it actually proved very useful a little bit later. It was the document that I was madly highlighting the night before the day of the action, and it proved very useful for arguments when debating Evan Solomon on power and politics. So I left Winnipeg to become a page, and while I was in Parliament, I saw the government moving in completely the wrong direction. We know this story. They are spending billions of dollars on fighter jets when they need to be investing in the public services that we value. We are facing an environmental crisis, which my friends so eloquently spoke about, where there are millions of people who are being displaced as we speak, hundreds of thousands of people who are dying because of droughts and because of famines. And it really comes down to water. Either there is too much water or not enough water. And we are seeing how our government is choosing to expand the tar sands when we need to be moving in completely the opposite direction. I mean, the tar sands are really the source of a lot of the climate change that is happening. It is the most polluting energy source on the planet, and the government is choosing to expand it. And we also see the government choosing to reject the Kyoto Protocol. And actually, it was when the Conservative government rejected the climate change bill that I first got the idea to do some kind of action in the Senate. Knowing that our collective future and the survival of humanity is at stake. So it was myself and a few other pages who had an emergency meeting in the bathroom to try to figure out what we were going to do. And we thought about, what about if we put tar sands water in the glasses of the senators? We decided not to do that. We didn't want to poison anybody. So we went back to the drawing board. And after the Harper government got its majority, we knew what was to come. Now they were given free rein to go ahead with their policy agenda. And that's when I realized that I had to act. So I want to take you there, to that moment in the Senate. And there is, David Johnson, who is sitting there. There's all of the senators who are lined up. And I knew that I had to act, but I was so scared. I was thinking about my family back home and what they were going to say, how they were going to react. How was I going to explain this to them at Thanksgiving dinner? I was thinking about getting arrested, and I was scared about the potential for getting arrested. And I was afraid about losing my job. But it was really when thinking about the people that Harper's agenda is impacting, workers, families, women, Indigenous peoples, people of color, who are being impacted by Harper, and the need and the sense of responsibility to be in solidarity with those people. And afterwards, it has been really amazing to meet so many progressive-minded people and to really feel the sense of belonging as part of a progressive family like I've never felt before. So when I was working in the Senate, and like so many people have told me when they're talking about their own personal feelings in terms of how they feel if they can impact change. And so many people who I've talked to have also expressed these same feelings about feeling hopeless, feeling alone, feeling isolated. But I must say, after this year, which has been an incredible year of social movements, of awakening, I really feel so excited about our future that we're building together. Today, I really believe that we can halt climate change, and I believe that we can stop Harper and transform a failing economic system, despite a broken democracy, which Ben talked about. But is this really a broken democracy? And as Ben talked about, no, it's not that it's broken. It's that there are fundamental flaws with this system. This system has never worked for Indigenous peoples. The Canadian state has been predicated on the annihilation of Indigenous peoples and the assimilation of Indigenous peoples, stealing their land for a capitalist Canadian dream. And it's really hard to talk about that and to come to terms with that, as a settler. But I am reminded of some words from a mentor of mine, Clayton Thomas Mueller, from the Indigenous Environmental Network. And he says that it's not about feeling guilty. It's about feeling a sense of responsibility and committing to supporting the struggles for sovereignty of Indigenous peoples and to committing to building those just relations together. There's a lot of talk about youth being apathetic, and I think that that is the elephant in the room. But in my experience, it is very far from this. In my experience, the young people that I meet, they care deeply about what is going on in their community, and they care about things like racism and inequality and our environment. But a major problem is that they don't feel like they can do anything about it. They don't believe that there's anything that they can do. And I think that a lot of that has to do with the context in which we are living, and the context in which many of us grew up in the 80s and 90s, where all we have seen is neoliberal governments who are not representing what we value. And we weren't born or saw the movements in the 60s and 70s, the mobilizing that happened in the streets that helped to stop the war in Vietnam, the incredible mobilizing of people of all walks of life, of the feminist movement for women's right to choose. These incredible movements, we weren't there, we did not witness them. So I do think that there's a feeling of powerlessness among many young people and among many people in general. I think one of the most interesting questions to ask people when we're exchanging is, do you feel like you can make a difference? Do you feel like there's something that you can do? And for a very long time, I think the response we would often get was no. But I really see how that is beginning to change. And that is beginning to change because of incredible social movements that have taken hold of our country and of the world, and that we are a part of right now. And there has been a very, very exciting movement in particular. It's familiar. Yeah. We are the 99%. When Occupy began, it was this complete shift that happened in attitudes. The we are the 99%, not the 1%, really had this feeling of uniting people and really sparking the dialogue about real alternatives to capitalism. It put inequality front and center, and we began to organize in our communities, meet each other, come from our private spaces into the public, and start talking about our collective future. But I still think that there was a sense of, okay, but what can social movements really do? What kind of concrete changes can they make? And I think for a long time, young people still felt like, what can social movements really do? But there has been something that happened so recently that has changed that completely. Okay. Le carré rouge. Yeah. C'est le symbole du mouvement étudiant au Québec. Et puis le slogan, c'était vraiment « Ensemble, nous bloquons la hausse ». So the slogan for the Quebec student movement was "Together we are blocking the hike." And what's amazing was students mobilized. They marched in the streets and they successfully blocked the tuition hike. The Quebec government recently changed their policies. Yeah. And they repealed the Law 78, which was criminalizing dissent. These are huge victories, and it feels so good to come together and celebrate our victories because we have so much to learn from these victories, and we can make that kind of mobilizing happen in the rest of Canada. So I think we have a lot to learn from that movement, and it shows us what is possible when we come together. I think the other key moment and movement that is happening is around the pipelines. And I don't have a sign to represent that, but what has been amazing has been seeing all of these different movements coming together for a united purpose. We're seeing Indigenous peoples, workers, environmentalists come together to oppose the Enbridge pipeline. And already we've had victories around the pipelines, like the Keystone XL pipeline. A lot of the civil disobedience and community mobilizing actually forced Obama to reject the Keystone XL. And it's been amazing to see how, the Enbridge pipeline, for a long time, that was a given. About a year ago, that was a certainty for some of these corporations. But after the mobilizing of people consistently and persistently, today, popular opinion now opposes this pipeline. And so we can continue to build on that momentum. And I think if we continue to build, that pipeline is not going through. Today, I believe we can stop climate change, and we can stop Harper, and we can fundamentally transform our economic system. And I believe this because of what has happened, because of what you have built, what past generations have built, and because of what is yet to come. I am so excited about Power Shift. Power Shift believes in shifting power from the corporate elites to us, to the rest of us, and it believes in shifting power from dirty fossil fuel energies to renewable energies. And it's a conference that's going to be happening in Ottawa in October that's going to be bringing together 1,500 young people from across the country to get trained, get educated, get mobilized, and really build the climate justice movement. This really is the challenge of our time. And it's amazing to hear people comparing it to past movements. Andrew Nicodefuk to the abolitionist movement, Clayton Thomas Mueller comparing it to the civil rights movement. Bill McKibben and Naomi Klein and Desmond Tutu are going on a tour to talk about divesting from the tar sands in a way that was similar to how they did it to stop apartheid in South Africa. So I believe that this movement is burgeoning, and it's starting to shift from the margins to the mainstream. And I always sort of see my dad as an indicator of how we're doing. And I am very happy to report that he has very much shifted in a lot of ways. He was supportive of the Quebec students and of the movement for free education. He invited an Indigenous person to speak in his class who firmly opposed the Enbridge pipeline. And so now the next step is I'm going to ask him if he wants to do civil disobedience against the pipeline, and I will let you know how that goes. There's something that George Lakey says, and he was part of the Movement for a New Society in the States, which really resonated with me. And it was that sometimes we indulge each other in complaining, rather than talking about our vision and our strategy and working hard to get there. And I think that that's something really important to keep in mind as we plow forward. And things are going to get difficult. They're already extremely difficult, and they're going to get more challenging. There are millions of people who are being displaced. The government is going to call them illegal and say that they're not allowed in our country. And we're going to need people to mobilize politically. We're also going to need people to house these people in their homes. Already, the government is criminalizing people who are acting responsibly against these pipelines and these extractive projects. So we're also going to need people to welcome them. There's so much incredible talent. And I think the question really is, how can we use this talent in the service of our movement to confront the challenges of our time? Because I really believe that if we fully use these gifts and these talents, we can overcome this challenge. I believe in a world where people are not forced to choose, either being responsible to the land and to future generations, or to put food on the table, but rather that they can meet the needs of their families in sustainable ways. I believe in a world where no one feels alone or divided, but where we feel love and belonging and unity over a common vision. I believe in a world where we do not feel helpless in the face of reckless corporations deciding our fate, but where we, the people, are the crafters of our own destiny. I believe in a time where we do not feel ashamed of our settler privilege, where no one feels ashamed of their culture, but where we feel joy from just relations that we have worked so hard to create together. I believe that this world is coming. I can feel it. I can feel it in your breath when we march together. I can feel it in your words on the page. I can feel her pulse right now as we exchange and come together. We are making another world possible because we are fearless, we are together, we are alive, and we are in motion.